It's great to have you all here. My name is Lindsay Smart. I'm in the HSC Office for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. Delighted to host out of the Diversity Office our Heritage Month series, and really working to also bridge our campuses and make sure that we're continually bringing our faculty, staff, and learners from both sides of Lomas, and also our extension campus, our campuses that are in Taos and Gallup and Valencia, and really just bringing everybody together and taking advantage of what Zoom has brought into our lives. What I am going to do is have a moment to introduce our speakers today, and that way you know who everybody is, and hopefully that fosters some connections after today. And then I'll be turning it over to them to lead us on some content and delivery. So today's talk, we have Haunted by Barriers, Creating Accessible Spaces. And if you weren't aware, we're on the very last day of the National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And there is a great website for this Heritage Month specific. And if you Google it and find some information to kind of further expand your knowledge after today. So what we'll do first is present Siobhán Cully, Dr. Siobhán Cully. And Dr. Siobhán Cully is an associate professor of anthropology at Rutgers University and a former program director at the National Science Foundation, where she co-led the Persons with Disabilities Working Group. She is interested in new perspectives on old debates in evolutionary anthropology, including how disabled people, adopted children, and women contribute to human evolution. She serves on the Rutgers University SAS DEI committee and on the AAAS, which I think probably stands for Association of Anthropology. No.
I think
Okay.
it's the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Oh, okay. I was not close enough. Multidisciplinary working group and for anti-ableism in STEM. So welcome, Siobhán. Next, we have Dr. Marissa Greenberg. Marissa Greenberg wears a few different hats related to disability in academia. As an associate professor of English, she teaches and researches representations of disability in 16th and 17th century English literature and its adaptation. As presidential teaching fellow, Marissa is working to build a community of practice for faculty with disabilities, with a long-term goal of creating an identity-based mentorship program for students with disabilities at UNM, and as special advisor on disability affairs to the vice president of the Division for Change and Empowerment, she is investigating current policies and procedures, resources, and needs related to faculty with disabilities. In this last role, Marissa is picking up research and advocacy efforts that she began as an academic faculty leadership fellow, and will continue through public-facing and scholarly publications, such as a paper that she and Dr. Coley recent co-authored. Marissa invites anyone interested in learning more about any of these initiatives to reach out to her, and her contact will be in the chat if it's not there already. Yeah, we'll get it there. So welcome, Marissa. And then next we have Ingrid Hendrix. Ingrid Hendrix is the division head for research, education, and clinical information services at the Health Sciences Library and Informatics Center, otherwise known as HSLIC, where she has been since 2001. Her primary faculty appointment is as a principal lecturer 3 in HSLIC. She also holds a secondary faculty appointment in the College of Nursing. Ingrid serves on the UNM Facilities Access Committee, the HSC Climate Assessment Action Group, and the HSC Inclusive Excellence Council. She guest lectures on the topic of caring for patients with disabilities to medical, nursing, and PT students, and is currently collaborating on an 18-month program on this topic for UNM's Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation Residency Program. Her advocacy in the community includes positions on the board of directors of the Assistance Dogs of the West and Laughing at My Nightmare, a national nonprofit organization which provides equipment and higher education grants to people with disabilities. Ingrid has limb girdle, muscular dystrophy, uses a power wheelchair, and a service dog. Always love to see in my window in the afternoons. So welcome to our presenters, welcome to our audience. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Marissa.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay, for those introductions. I'm just going to start by introducing just some, sorry, here we go, from the beginning. Just some key terms and concepts. Myself and Siobhán and Ingrid didn't want to presume what level of knowledge people came to this roundtable with. So this is going to be pretty kind of surface level, but hopefully give some just a foundation for folks who are coming today with questions and curiosity, which is always a wonderful place to start. So as Lindsay mentioned, this month is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And this graphic came across my LinkedIn, and I just thought it was a wonderful way, appropriate to the day, to introduce some of the daily challenges that folks with disabilities are grappling with, not that don't include their disability, right? Continually having to self-advocate, relying on others to listen, asking for support, explaining our needs, justifying our access, having to question the inaccessible, speak up against ableism, which is a term I'll return to in a moment, manage others' discomfort, prove our disabilities, fight for basic inclusion, keep fighting to exist, and to keep surviving the system. So I share this with you as kind of a way of explaining why the conversation that we're having today is necessary, and thank you all for joining it. So here are just some 5 foundational concepts, and I'm going to go through each of them very, very briefly. If you'd like to learn more, there's a link here to a LibGuide that I started with Glenn Coling through UNM Libraries. And if you have items to add, please do not hesitate to email them to me, and I'll work with Glenn to get them added to that LibGuide. But it's a good starting place for folks who have interest and questions. So just to start with disability itself, disabilities may be physical, emotional, mental, and/or sensorial. They may be readily, situationally, or barely apparent. That's sometimes referred to as visible and invisible or hidden disabilities. There are though connotations around visible and invisible or hidden that a lot of scholars and persons with disabilities have discomfort with, myself included. It presumes sightedness and also then puts this connotation around disabilities that aren't readily apparent as if we're trying to hide something when that's rarely the case. Disabilities may also be chronic or temporary, persistent or intermittent. So if you think that all disability looks, sounds, and feels the same, that is in fact not the case. Disability is quite varied. By the way, if as I'm talking, there are any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see the chat with my PowerPoint also live, but if there is a question, hopefully someone will call my attention to it. And if I can't answer it, luckily I have other experts in this room. Okay, so if disability is this varied experience, disability studies is a field that recognizes disability as a key aspect of human experience, and that the study of disability has important political, social, and economic implications for society as a whole, including both disabled and non-disabled people. One way to think about this is that we are all either currently disabled or will be disabled at some point in our lives. And those accommodations that make society more accessible for folks with disabilities tend to make society more accessible for everyone, The field of disability studies is also deeply intersectional and increasingly so, understanding disability as an identity in connection with other identities, having social, cultural, historical, legal, and political perspectives. Okay. I'm happy to send out the slides subsequently. Also, that this meeting is being recorded, so that too can be shared. But thanks for the question. Okay. There we go. Moving very quickly along to ableism and disableism. The term disableism doesn't tend to get used a lot, but I use it to talk about overt acts of harassment and discrimination, whereas ableism is a bit harder to detect at times. I love this particular definition. There are a lot of wonderful definitions out there, but this one by a legal scholar, Fiona Kumari Campbell. Ableism is a network of beliefs, processes, and practices that produces a particular kind of self and body, the corporeal standard, that is projected as the perfect, species typical, and therefore essential and fully human. Disability then is cast as a diminished state of being human. And so maybe if you end up going out trick-or-treating tonight and you're looking at the witches and the ghouls and the goblins and the ways in which a lot of those stereotypes are also linked to disability, what you're seeing there is this long history of ableism as a kind of cultural norm of what is a standard body, a standard mind, and anything that deviates from that standard is seen as often or perceived as less than human. And that ableism, that attitude pervades culture in a lot of many, many subtle ways. So back in 2022, I conducted with Dr. Asata Zarai, the VP of DSE, the Division for Change and Empowerment, a survey of UNM faculty with disabilities. And here are four of the basic key, or the four of the key findings from this survey that included both quantitative and qualitative data. That faculty with disabilities are managing their disabilities alongside their clinical, creative, scholarly, and research work, teaching, and service. For many disabled faculty, their adverse experiences with colleagues and leadership create a lack of trust that impacts disclosure, access, inclusion, and retention. Many faculty with disabilities cite examples to provide evidence that UNM has room for improvement in becoming culturally and infrastructurally welcoming to faculty with disabilities. And many faculty with disabilities are making do and, in their words, powering through. Some are surviving, and few who completed the survey indicate that they are thriving. And unfortunately, many more indicate that they are suffering. Before I move to my last slide, which takes up this last bit on disclosure and barriers, one quick note on this slide. I like to toggle between faculty with disabilities and disabled faculty. Some people have a preference between what is sometimes referred to as person-first language, faculty with disabilities, and other people prefer identity-first, disabled faculty. Like with most terminology, the best thing to do is ask what someone prefers and then use what they prefer. And so I think this is probably the first question that Lindsay's going to be asking, but I'm gonna prime the pump, as it were, that when we talk about barriers to access and inclusion for faculty with disabilities, those barriers aren't just physical or infrastructural, even though there are definitely physical and infrastructural barriers on our campus and in the surrounding communities, but they're also temporal and cultural. And so this is just a short list of some of the barriers that were most frequently identified in that survey that was conducted back in 2022. And so I'm going to stop sharing there, and we'll move on to the next part of the roundtable, unless there are questions in the chat.
There's one question about number of faculty that participated in the survey, and maybe also clarify which campus is probably helpful.
Yeah, so Siobhán entered that data also into
the there it is.
Yeah, thank you, Siobhán, for doing that. We did not collect information about colleges in order to keep the responses de-identified. Also, because of, and I thought I'd had a slide on this and maybe I just went completely past it. Because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the laws around that, we do not, in fact, know how many faculty have identify as having a disability. We do not know how many faculty have formally requested accommodation. This is all legally protected data. So the numbers here have to be interpreted in the absence of that information.
Is it correct then to assume that all campuses were invited to participate?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Well, if you have questions, keep putting them in as we keep talking. Before I open it with one of our first questions for panelists, I did want to just offer if Siobhán or Ingrid, if there were any opening things you wanted to share. You don't have to, but just making sure that you had some space before dialing in on specific questions.
I mean, that was a great introduction. I really appreciated it, and I will be stealing that. Any related workshops that I participated in going on. So I don't have anything else to add. I'm quite happy to move on to the Q&A, but maybe Ingrid does. Thanks.
No, I agree with Siobhán. Thank you, Marissa. I think it was really great to have that sort of background and understanding before we get started in the question section. So I'm good.
All right. Well, with our first question, and maybe this will prime folks on the call to build on it. And the question is, what systemic changes can be made to address the most frequently reported accessibility barriers, such as parking and accommodations requests for individuals with a disability? And I'll also put that question in the chat, and I can repeat it too. So systemic changes.
Well, I can jump in. My disability, of course, is physical. I use power wheelchairs, so I've certainly run up against the physical barriers that have happened around campus. I think it would be really appropriate if we gave dedicated parking to people with disabilities. As it stands now, employees with disabilities have to fight with the people who are visiting campus, or in our case, we're right next to a primary care clinic. So all the disabled spaces are taken. So I think it'd be really important to provide that option to people with disabilities who are employed here on campus. I think one of the biggest things is making it more obvious as to how to request accommodations and how to make it easier for people to do that. Because many people have come to me with visible disability and asked, how do I get accommodations? I don't even know how that works. So I think we need to make that more obvious. And I think one of the ways to do that is with some more proactive communication, like during the onboarding or the hiring process, or at some point early on. And I think that would also speak to how people perceive the campus as welcoming to people with disabilities. I think our UNM job system is also not particularly well set up for people with visual disabilities. So things like that could be really helpful. And, providing mandatory training in Learning Central so people get the kind of foundational knowledge that Marissa shared with us early on. Because in some cases, I think people are like, well, we don't want to make these accommodations, it's going to be expensive, et cetera, et cetera. But I think a lot of people just don't know and understand what's involved in working when you have a disability. So I'll leave it to my other co-presenters to not take up all the space here.
Thank you. I mean, I like to just hang out and jump in at the end after everybody said everything that needs to be said. Um, I was going to comment on some of those same things. I mean, I think there are a lot of different barriers that people experience that can also be informed by a lot of existing research for people who come from underrepresented backgrounds, generally speaking, and including research regarding intersectional identities and the specific challenges people may face along a number of different dimensions. As an anthropologist, I think a lot about the kinds of cultural things that Ingrid was alluding to too, and welcoming disability and, through training and destigmatizing and having people in leadership positions who disclose their disabilities, whether they're readily apparent or not, I think are all ways that we can help folks to understand that this is a natural part of the human condition and one that offers some really unique and important insights and opportunities for innovation. So I think those cultural shifts are a really big part of what needs to happen at UNM and elsewhere. One thing too, to follow on to what Ingrid said in terms of documentation and the sort of processes of acquiring accommodations, those do need to be clarified for people. I think there's an identity process sometimes for people who acquire disabilities. That was certainly my experience, where I didn't identify as disabled for a long time and wasn't even aware that there were accommodations processes for people in my situation. And so I think normalizing that, training on it for everyone is so important. The other thing I think can happen, and I use this in my classrooms all the time, is that, people don't have to have documented disabilities for us to invite them to ask what they need for their particular circumstances. So I will often teach and say that I have a disability, that I welcome accommodations requests, but also that if there are ways that I can adjust my curriculum, that I'm happy to consider those and have those conversations with my students. So I just say everything that we can do to kind of normalize disability and to welcome and celebrate people with disabilities on campus across levels, those will really help to remove those barriers in these kind of really widespread ways that, as Marissa alluded to earlier, don't have to be unique to individual situations necessarily.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback up on that, Siobhán's comment, and there are also some questions, some great questions going on in the chat. The question about proactivity at UNM, about providing accommodation. I think the conversation already so far shows that the process itself is a reactive process. You have to request an accommodation for the policies and procedures to get kickstarted. I the thing that I wanted to pick up on with Siobhán is something that's really unique, I think, to institutions of higher education from other places of employment where disability and disclosure and accommodation might be at play. And that is right. We are a place that prioritizes knowledge, the knowledge that we have all inherited through our as expertise, as well as the knowledge that we're all creating through our research. And trying to disseminate both through our teaching and our publications and creative work, et cetera. And I think one thing that I really love about what Siobhán said about how she approaches disability and accommodation in her classrooms is that she's trusting her students to know their bodies, know their minds, know their needs, and to be able to communicate those and to have conversation about what's possible. And I think that kind of both intellectual curiosity, trusting in the lived experience of our students, and a certain kind of foundation of trust would be a wonderful way for us to make, as an institution, to make systemic change in the ways that we work not only with our students, but also with our faculty and staff with disabilities. And I think, again, recognizing expertise, recognizing research, and recognizing lived experience, all from a starting place of trust and collegial process and conversation.
Thank you. I think we'll probably end up circling back to systemic changes for all of these questions, but looking at the chat, in fact, actually is a nice segue to one of the questions that we were going to ask, which was about inclusive design principles and inclusive design principles for future campus renovations, ensuring accessibility for identities and abilities. And so the question in the chat is specific to some of the projects going on here on the North Campus with the hospital structure being built and the School of Medicine building looking to be hopefully built in the next, I'm not sure how many years, but to be built in the future, and considering the construction process where you often are meeting with architects and you're coming up with designs and then of course what you design and what you actually implement. So if there's anything that our panelists might be able to share about inclusive design principles and renovations in general, but also maybe specifically looking at this question.
Well, I could take up the next hour or two on this topic, but I will try to stay within the time frames. Yeah, that's a really great question, Ed. I think one of my biggest challenges on this campus, of course, is using a wheelchair. So many buildings get built and they say, oh, our architects know all about ADA, it'll be fine. And like the new Dominici building, they put all the push buttons. The only way I can use them is if I push them with my head because they are so high up on the wall. And they were put within the ADA level, but they put them at the top of that level rather than in the middle where it's more useful for people. And I sit pretty tall, so if somebody's in a manual chair, that's like that much more difficult. But they were like, the first building they built, it was like, well, we engineered out the push buttons because we didn't have money for it. And it was like, so you might as well lock the doors for a good percentage of people. You're just not making it a welcoming environment for people to use. The other thing I personally hate is bathrooms with doors on them. I don't think that's really necessary, especially the way you design buildings. I think architecture building maybe doesn't have doors. They've set it up so that you're not looking right into the bathroom, but it's easy to get around. More signage for accessible routes. It's like, where is the ramp? Where is the push button? And this is something that Facilities Access has, the committee has had tried to move the needle on this, but having someone with a disability be involved in the construction design, so it's not some able-bodied architect saying, "Oh yeah, I read all the, specs and it's fine." It's like, unless you use it, you really don't understand what is needed for that space. So I'll step off my soapbox and
I
give
just want to follow up on that because that seems really ridiculous to me. There should be some written guidelines that are common for all architectural designs where they need to be accessible. And it seems really, I can't think of a good word that's not a cuss word. It seems really ridiculous that people can't find that information out and that it's just not innate to the building process.
agree with you 100%.
But
Yeah.
so,
Oh, just to speak to that for a moment, I mean, I think, not to absolve anyone of problems in terms of inclusive design, but I think it can feel overwhelming sometimes to accommodate a variety of different kinds of disabilities, and I think that's why the answer to this question in my mind is really to include as many people with as many different disabilities as you can in the design from the outset, and to allocate those resources up front, knowing that it will cost you money to put in, a door actuator. Maybe you need a couple of door actuators at different levels, like they do on the New Jersey transit system, right? And again, people use those for all sorts of reasons, including hygiene and things like that. So all of these things tend to benefit more than just the population they're identified for. But I just say, like, it's not built into redesign. I'm working on building an accessible bench lab right now in my new institution, and get asked a series of very specific questions around what I need for different sorts of disabilities, because we're trying to go beyond what the ADA says. And it's really challenging because I have my experience, but I don't have the experience of, for example, a low vision student who is someone I want to accommodate, or a deaf student is somebody I want to accommodate, or various kinds of neurodivergence. And what I'd like to do is get students in, on the ground floor, so to speak, to help me with this design so I know where to take it and kind of build in that flexibility. But I think oftentimes the way administration and buildings go, it's not that flexibility, and sort of consultative period needs to be built in.
but people write papers, they write academic papers on things that could include this. So would it be impossible to solicit, to recruit other authors from all sorts of disabilities to put together a guideline that you could even publish in an architectural journal or something that would at least be a first starting point to help?
And to layer onto that, what I often find with many things is guidelines get ignored. So is it about the guideline, or is it about policy structures, or, are there, some of it is you try to come up with a psychological messaging to motivate people to make these changes because it's the right thing to do, versus this is the policy requirement for whomever gets the bid for this project, or those sorts of things. So just adding that to
Yeah, I
Michelle's
think you
question.
definitely have to have advocates on various levels, but there has to be a starting point And I don't know exactly where it is. I mean, I'm involved in a society where, people publish guidelines, and then there's also a policy part where they try to take these guidelines if they're, appropriate to pushing forward policy. I know we can't all do everything. It just seems like someone should have thought of this before, like somebody with the power to do something. Maybe it's us. I don't know. Maybe it's you guys. I can weigh in on
It's an
having
asked
crappy
question.
hearing and not being able to hear in any of the rooms and people not using the microphone properly, where I think we could have microphones that don't move when people want to look at their slides, and rooms with better acoustics.
Mhm. Definitely. I think that there are a couple of places I know at the Center for Development and Disability, they have microphones in all of their conference rooms. And it's even during like a meeting that I facilitated there for folks who weren't really connected to the CDD, it was my sort of contact that said, everybody has to speak into the microphone, and really just having a champion and leader who's really saying, this is our guidelines for our space, and having somebody there to enforce it really helped remind people about the
Yeah, I mean,
importance of
I try to do that in our department because I'm sure there are other people who cannot hear well that are not going to speak up, but I'm so tired of asking people. But I guess I just can't be tired. I mean, it's okay to do that. And just, I'm good at nagging anyway, so I'll
It's okay
stop.
to be tired. It's good to have a team of people, though, because at some point you do need to rely on others to help support and pass the baton and carry the change while you catch your breath and come back renewed. So you're okay. You're okay to be tired. I did want to bring attention to the question that Heather Canavan put in the chat, and I wasn't sure, Heather, if you wanted to actually speak and comment on it, but the question is about building design, ADA, and intersectionality.
Great. So it's more of a comment than a question, but I wanted to bring it up because you've just touched on something that I'm really interested in. But before I get going, I want to say hi, Ingrid. It's been a couple of years since I saw you. I actually had Ingrid come and speak to my class on adaptive design years ago, and I haven't taught it again recently, but I will in the next year. So I'll hopefully have you be able to come back and speak again. But the class that I teach on adaptive design, one of the things that I had my students in engineering do was they would go to a building that was built in the brutalist style that's typical of chemical engineering in the 70s, that is really not accessible to almost anyone, right? And then I would have them come to one of the newer buildings, in our case, Ferris Engineering, where chemical and computer science engineering are, and then observe the two buildings and then come back and give feedback on what they saw. And this was in a class called Adaptive Design, where I had just given them lectures on the ADA. They had just learned a lot about it. And I didn't lead them any more than that, except to go off in teams and then come back. And the first couple of years that I did this with my class, it was what you would expect. It's like I can only get in on this one floor. There's only one elevator. It doesn't work all the time. Those kind of comments about the older building, which definitely illustrated the point, I thought. But what was really interesting to me was that the last time I taught the class was during the pandemic. And the students who went out and then came back, the first thing they said about Ferris, which is the newly designed building, is there's no place to hide if there's a shooter. And I was blown away. I had never thought of that. But the buildings that have been built, particularly in STEM, over the past 20 years have been really focused on how to make them more inclusive, particularly for underrepresented minority and groups. And the idea was, if I can see myself in the building, then it's more welcoming. And if I have fewer closed off spaces, then it's more welcoming, and so forth. And so it really kind of echoed what was the previous concern, right? Of, brutalist was really like forcing you to pay attention. You couldn't look outside, blah, blah, blah. So we're going opposite that. And then I realized the kids who are in college now, and now also the ones who are in graduate school, are the post-Columbine era, where every year they've had 5 lockdown drills, not just the movie that we watch of run, hide, shoot, or whatever, run, hide, fight back, but actually lockdown drills. And I thought, oh, shit. Um, what have we done? And so I wanted to bring this up because we're talking about how sometimes we're not taking into account ADA and so forth, which is a really serious concern. But sometimes we're also not taking into concern the more recent traumas. Because I think of this as if this is the first thing that these college students are telling me, or actually graduate school students, that is um, pretty traumatizing. And I just realized this is something that could, I think, be considered a more of a mental concern, but could be something that is extreme for people who are also disabled. Because I was thinking, I know in Ferris, there is literally no place to hide. On the first floor, there is everything is glass. All the offices' doors are glass. All of the spaces are glass. There is literally no place to hide. If you are a wheelchair user, you can't get up to another floor because the elevators will be shut down. And I thought I would bring this up to this group because I'm very curious to hear, have you also heard of similar concerns? Have you thought about this yourself? Is this something that has risen to anyone else's sort of, has it bubbled up in consciousness yet, or is this something that is just kind of a unique observation? I'm curious. Thank you.
I'm happy to try and respond, at least in part, to that. I'm also putting something into the chat that I think speaks to this part of the conversation. So specifically on the experiences that undergraduate and graduate students are currently bringing. A course that I teach every few semesters is a course on tragic literature. And I have students do a semester-long project that I call Tragedy After. And it's inspired by a wealth of scholarship along the lines of, tragedy after Auschwitz, tragedy after 9/11. What are the kind of key moments for our students that define their experience of tragedy? And a significant number of them talk about school shootings. And they're writing these journals like every other week in relationship to theories of tragedy from the ancient world all the way to the present. So this keeps coming up for them. So yes, I've seen this as a perennial concern. And I also agree, like when we're thinking about how we design our campus, both the physical campus, but also the technical campus, the online, for example, there are lots of factors that we're trying to juggle, and you can't make everybody happy all of the time kind of idea. And so I put in the chat from goal 3 of the UNM 2040 plan. One of the objectives is ensure UNM is inherently inclusive, accessible, and readily accommodating to most by strengthening inclusive excellence infrastructure, right? It acknowledges that sometimes you make one change in one way to accommodate and include as many people as possible, but that very change may result in an exclusionary effect for others. And this is where I think using universal design principles, then making necessary accommodations for the unique populations that we serve at UNM, and then making modifications to whenever possible so that inclusion is as expansive, as capacious as possible. Recognizing that even then it may not be perfect. And that's when I think maybe we come back to systemic change and the institution saying, yeah, like maybe sometimes we're just failing students, we're failing staff and faculty, and what can we do next time or in a different context to not fail.
And if I could jump back on this topic, something I didn't mention, I know it's very specific, and thank you, Siobhán, for pointing out the, making these modifications for everyone, not just particular disabilities, because of course I'm focused on physical because that's what my experience is at. But one thing that really struck me with all the spaces, because I do a fair amount of teaching, none of the faculty or podiums in any of the classrooms are accessible. So to me, that was a very clear message. You don't belong teaching here. So you are not to be standing at the front of the room doing a class because we're not going to make this space accessible for you. And of course, it also, if students are doing presentations or people who can't stand for 2 hours or whatever the, class space is, but it sends a very clear message that you are not considered an expert in your area and should not be at the front of the classroom. I mean, we could talk about pedagogy and should you be at the front of the classroom, but that's a whole other thing. But it was just, to me, a very kind of gut punch that I was not seen as somebody who should be at the front of the room. So I just wanted to throw that one out there since we're talking about faculty and faculty spaces.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, I think there's so much research on disability and yet so little at the same time. Like, you wish that there was this really huge corpus of evidence-based practice for architectural design for faculty with disabilities, and I doubt there is actually. I think the research on faculty in particular with disabilities is relatively thin. There's a lot on students, that's been a concern. There's a lot on underrepresented populations in general, increasingly with intersectional identities, but disabled faculty per se. Actually, there's less than one might think, at least in my searching. And trying to build up a lab. I mean, I'm writing a chapter on that because I'm not aware of a set of guidelines to help with that, and have reached out to people on this multidisciplinary working group, which is run by one of the big science advocacy agencies, in our nation. So I think there are trade-offs everywhere, as Marissa said, and I think here too it's tricky because you have your experience as a disabled person and can be called on to represent all disabled people, which is impossible. And you want to be part of these conversations because you need representation, but you can't be everywhere at once. And so I think, resolving these issues in terms of design, planning, implementation, yeah, it's I think we all need to be involved to the extent that we can be without burning ourselves out. But being part of these multidisciplinary working groups for me, for example, has been huge because it's just increased the network that I have beyond my discipline, beyond my institution, and into these much broader conversations. So those might be some avenues for all of us to be thinking about.
So the reason that I brought this to this group in particular is because of, I don't actually know your name, Mosbun, but Mosbun had said, who is it that can do this kind of thing? How can we, are we the ones who should be doing it? And then honestly, that's what I created my class to do, right? The idea was at UNM, our engineering programs are half women and half underrepresented minority, which is really unusual in engineering, right? And my thought was if I could give them projects that were inspired by people who had disabilities that were telling them what I actually want is not what you think I want is. And Ingrid brought up the issue of the buttons at that point, and so the idea was if I am working with these students, I'm giving them something that is not a difficult, let's face it, it is not a difficult engineering challenge in terms of technical ability, but it is difficult in the terms of you actually have to go back and ask for feedback, and you can't just go with what you thought was the right idea, which is not easy for engineering students to admit they're wrong. But the idea being that if you have people that are working together, I kind of would tie it back to how, people who were protesting pre-ADA were also protesting with the Black Panthers. And, it was a very intersectional group. And I thought, this is a way to make it so you're not the only faculty member who's bringing this up at your faculty meeting, or you're not the only person. And I thought that was really great. But then I realized, oh, this issue, I think, has been not seen necessarily in general, but also I thought maybe there are people in this virtual room who have thoughts about what would make design of buildings safer for the population that you understand the best. And the reason I bring it up is because I wrote a paper, or I wrote an abstract to present at ASEE. So if anybody has anything that they wanted to tell me, I would really like to hear it, because I was going in with this background of my students in engineering and thinking about the ADA and so forth from the students that I've worked with and so forth, but thinking more about, well, I agree, we can learn from what has already been done. So what can I do in this one venue that I have that could help push the needle, as you say? So any advice appreciated.
And I'll piggyback, just knowing the timeline. 5 minutes left is if you answer this question, and also if you have any just final words that you would like this group to most take away as I know on our North Campus, but I think on both campuses at UNM, we will be working on this topic pretty heavily in the next year. So at least heavier than I think our North Campus maybe has looked at it, so. Like to go first. Or if you don't have a direct response and just want to pocket it and then email Heather later and follow up, that works as well, but also just an opportunity for our panelists to have a last opportunity to share.
Last word, I'll jump in there. And Heather, I definitely love to connect with you and certainly come back and talk to your students. But I don't have anything in particular right now for that. But just in closing, I think, as Michelle had brought up, I think the solidarity piece, since there do not seem to be, at least visibly disabled faculty in droves on campus, and it's difficult to find who those people are, whatever kind of disability they have. It definitely feels like you're a voice in the wilderness. So I think having these kind of events and getting to know people, I just really appreciate how many people are obviously interested in this topic, came to this presentation, want to learn more, want to participate. I just think that's very encouraging to see that kind of thing. So I really appreciate everybody's interest and participation today. And certainly my amazing panelists, who I would love to talk to in more detail as well.
I'll just put a little shout out for something that Siobhán put into the chat. She and I have been collaborating on a paper that's currently under review, and we'd be very happy to hear from folks. Siobhán put her email. I'll put mine again in the chat. because as Michelle, otherwise known as Mazbun, I love that, put right, and Siobhán also put right, that working in community not only strengthens our own well-being, but gives us a way to communicate that counteracts the isolation that disability experience and certainly disability legislation, including ADA in the employment context, can produce. If we want systemic change, then we need to be able to find points of shared experience and common goals and communicate those to leadership. And then when individual modifications need to be made, they get made, as opposed to working from the individual as if the person with a disability is the problem rather than the various systems, whether physical or infrastructural or technological or policy and procedure. So the more we can work in community, the better we'll be as individuals, but also as a collective.
Here, here. I mean, thank you for creating the space and keep it going. Like, if the university won't sponsor a disability group or hasn't already, even though I know there's the DEIA committee, make those groups yourselves, keep those conversations going. Having one additional person at a faculty meeting who supports your need for some change is enormous relative to feeling like you're the only one asking all the time. So keep this space, keep it open. Thank you for having me here as part of it. These issues transcend institutions, and thank you again for creating the space.
Thank you all. I think this has been very powerful to just have the dialogue, have some content, and I've been taking some notes because our North Campus, we have been working to do an action plan related to our previous climate assessment, and one of the of two areas which I think you both touched on, all of you touched on both, was universal design, accessibility, and disability, but also institutional trust. And those two, I think, are going to dovetail nicely in how we move forward with some sort of action. So I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you being here, and we've got email shared. Please do reach out if you have any further questions or want to make sure you connect with somebody. And if you have abstracts and once the paper is published, please do share it with me so I can get it out to our listserv, and maybe that's an opportunity to bring us together for another dialogue panel to talk about the paper in a more kind of direct way, and keep building these relationships on this topic. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your Friday, and we'll see you soon for more events.
Thank you. Bye-bye.